Welcome to the Future of Finance discussion on the strange lack of technological disruption in foreign exchange. Thank you for joining us, and I now pass you over to Dominic Hobson and the panel. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dominic Hobson, founder of Future of Finance. It's my privilege to moderate our discussion today, which is about the strange lack of technological disruption in foreign exchange. The 6.6 trillion a day foreign exchange market is a market which has a reputation for getting as close to the impossible textbook model of perfect competition as any market that has yet developed. There's lots of participants, low barriers to entry, continuous liquidity, perfect price formation, and it's perfectly arbitraged. No profitable opportunity lasts for more than a few seconds. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. That is as unrealistic a picture of how FX works as it is of any market. FX shows the same bias to oligopoly as any mature market. Credit sets a very high barrier to entry. Illiquidity is a serious problem, even in major currency pairs. Price information is patchy, it's incomplete, it's often misleading. In fact, the information asymmetries are so systemic that FX remains, even after all the disappearance of currencies over the last 30 years, one of the most lucrative ways in which banks and quasi-banks can exploit buy-side institutions and corporations. In other words, the customers are definitely paying a lot more for FX than they should be. Now, two of the things we talk about at Future of Finance all the time, digital technology and digital data, clearly have the power to weight the dice a little less in favor of the incumbents and a little bit more in favor of the customers. Yet so far, they've not had that much effect at all. Our question today is, why is that? And to help us answer that, I'm joined by three experts in the field, each of which approaches this question from a subtly different angle. Rosario Ingagiola is a technologist and entrepreneur who's helped hedge funds and trading desks active in the FX markets, and now, as founder and CEO of Bosonic, is looking to transform the FX prime brokerage business. Adrian Patton is a former FX spot dealer who co-founded Cobalt, a company whose mission is to reshape the post-trade infrastructure of the FX industry. Andy Woolmer is a former currency fund manager who set up New Change FX in 2012 to provide an independent live streaming mid-rate for FX currency pairs with the aim of helping the buy side to manage its FX execution costs more effectively. Now, in addition to our panelists, we do, of course, also have you, our audience, and all four of us encourage everybody watching or listening to submit questions and comments throughout this webinar by using the Q&A or chat functionality at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Rest assured, we won't be saving these up to the end. We'll look to answer them as we go along. We've got quite a lot to talk about over the next hour, so let's get going. I'd like to begin by just asking a question really about how the market works today. Now, Adrian, FX is a market where, according to the BIS survey, 40% of trading activity is still by voice. In other words, this is a relatively unreconstructed market. Why is it so difficult to restructure the foreign exchange industry, do you think?
I would argue that it is being restructured, but much of the industry isn't noticing. I think there is, I would even argue with your the title of the conference, The Strange Lack of Innovation. I think there is innovation, but people aren't seeing it from where they'd like to see it, from the main providers, the main banks, and the main exchanges and service providers. It's coming elsewhere. I see that Revolut, where I can trade FX at spot 24/7. I can trade with LMAX 24/7, both FX and digital. I can see now big crypto trading firms who are regulated by the CFTC as clearinghouses getting into foreign exchange. I just think there's two worlds out there. There's the big traditional world with the likes of all these incumbent monopolistic service providers, and new world, and things going on that I can see that I can't mention, where new institutions or existing institutions are going to disrupt things. But I can see crypto stroke new FX, and I've forgotten the likes of Finality. They announced something recently for cross-border payments. So I think there is innovation going on, and I think there is disruption going on, but a lot of people aren't noticing it. And some of them aren't going to notice it until it's eaten their lunch.
Now, Rosario, I'd like to bring you in on this, particularly on the question of bank intermediation. But before we do that, I'd like to ask Andy really to give us a perspective on the same question. Clearly, as Adrian says, there is innovation going on. He mentions Revolut, for example. But if I look at Revolut, basically it's offering me interbank rates on a bunch of FX pairs. So it's still controlled ultimately by the banks. There's a kind of 80-20 problem here, is that the incumbent banks. This is a market in which 5 banks control 80% of what goes on. So it's a classic oligopoly. And all of those people doing innovation will obviously struggle and have to deal with the fact that they're up against some very large financial institutions which are making a great deal of money. What's you've been at this now for 8 years, trying to change behavior. What's it like going up against the Blob, or whatever we call it?
Well, we're not trying to go up against anybody. I mean, we're just trying to provide information to people so that they can trade at a more economical fashion. But I think the point here is that the 80-20, as you say, or the 5 banks that really own the foreign exchange market. The problem is that if you're a smaller bank, then the investment required to actually be a significant player is so huge that you just can't get there. It's just not possible to really compete if you're not, sort of a top 10 player at the moment. At the same time, we're seeing, people like XTX and Jump and all these people coming into the market making space. And certainly they're eating the lunch of the smaller banks. The tier 2 institutions are just recycling pricing from the tier 1 institutions. And that's where it's sort of splitting. But I wanted to say that I think Adrian's right, that there is an enormous amount of innovation going on in the background. But a bank isn't an amorphous blob. There's bits of banks that are doing very interesting and innovative things at the moment, and using new technologies that they can get their hands on, and engaging with crypto and with different ideas. And that seems to be, the path they'll take. I think there's probably a general view from bank management that whilst the customers aren't demanding change, they'll just sit there with the old model for as long as it needs to go on, or can go on, I should say. But the new model is there in the wings. I mean, there seems to be a lot of activity in banks about using, from our point of view, using mid rates in lots of different applications. But I'm sure that extends out across crypto and across new forms of technology that are evolving. I don't think it's, a lack of uptake. It's more like it's below the waterline at the moment.
I'm interested by one of the things you say about as long as the customers aren't demanding change, why should they have it? In a way, that the buy-side institutions of the corporates have the FX market they deserve. But I'd like to pick up with you, Rosario, one of the other phenomena which Andy mentioned, which is Jump and XTX, for example, these non-bank liquidity providers, as they're called. As far as I understand how they work, they're still entirely dependent upon bank credit through the FX prime brokerage industry. So in effect, they're like a hedge fund. The banks have outsourced part of their trading activity to these institutions, and they live or die by how much credit the bank is prepared to accord to them. So how can we, and to go back to what I said at the outset about 40% voice trading, which is very unusual in any kind of money or securities market these days, probably more common in money markets than others, but still unusually high proportion is being done the old-fashioned way, like it was 40 years ago when I worked at Morgan Grenfell, where Adrian had a spell, I think, as well. Why haven't online trading platforms had a bigger impact on the FX market, and what could be done to change it? Rosario.
Yeah, well, you touched on a couple of different things there. I have no idea why there's so much voice trading. That's actually seems surprising, because I thought that most of what the BIS was putting out was saying that about 80% of the market was electronified. But I think in terms of the market makers, what you said is spot on about basically bank credit. I mean, the whole the entire system works based on access to the market, which is all facilitated by bank credit and tier one bank credit intermediation. And so I think that's that's definitely a choke point. And we saw, what is it, maybe less than a year ago, Citi come out and get rid of a whole bunch of clients that were sort of in that category based on some of the losses that they had previously, and just kind of a general attitude towards de-risking. There's obviously regulatory changes that are increasing the capital costs around having these credit allocations, outstanding between all these different counterparties. And it's just inherently problematic. If you look at even just the way they manage and not having clear visibility into the intraday exposures of a given, counterparty or a given client who has a credit line with many, many different counterparties, there can be some pretty big surprises. And I think that's part of why we see some of the de-risking, which poses, further problems, because obviously the more sources of liquidity that we can have, the more diversity around that, the better. And I think we all know that the banks have a increasingly shrinking share of the market in terms of liquidity provision. As far as the platforms are concerned, I mean, I think it really comes down to the same thing. If you don't, to have a successful platform means you have the banks essentially buying into allowing people that they're giving credit to access and trade on those platforms. And so I don't know if anybody's, if anybody on the call has ever been, in the position of having to try to talk with a prime broker about giving clients access, to a particular platform that you're as a small company, putting out. It's quite the process. And so ultimately, I think it's just that they have a bit more control than we might like to admit.
Now, one of the points Rosario has made here is that banks do take real risk, as Citi found out, and is now looking to de-risk its book of business. So we shouldn't be totally dismissive of what they bring to the foreign exchange market. But I'd like to pick up something you said, Adrian, about stock exchanges and clearinghouses coming into this business. Could you share with us a little bit what you think they're trying to do? Is this obviously looking to bring FX trading on exchange? If they own a clearinghouse as well, they're also looking to create margin savings for the clients, I assume, and cross-collateralize their business. But at the same time, they don't seem to have had that much of an impact on the marketplace yet. Is that going to change? You're on mute, Adrian.
Sorry about that. So
you'll do it.
Before I get to the exact part of your question, a couple of things. Not all of these banks are making a lot of money. Some of them have a ridiculous cost base. There are some that have post-trade FX operational costs of $1 billion a year. It's a lot of the problem are some of the ways they poor data, expensive technology. Let's be honest, they get charged a fortune from some of the monopolistic service providers who just resell them back their own data. So it's not just all about the banks here, and they have a massive cost base. It's more that the infrastructure and how all the data works is bad. So, but back to the exchanges, my point was more that you have these crypto exchanges currently, and some of them are making a real large amounts of money, revenues of over $1 billion a year. And some of them are regulated by the CFTC as exchanges and clearinghouses. And it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to suspect that, in effect, many of them really are trading FX, because you're trading Bitcoin against yen, Bitcoin against euro, and you're getting all the fiat balances. It doesn't take a great deal to imagine that some might start to offer services in foreign exchange where you can settle your transactions within the day, because that's what these people are used to. So it was less about more traditional exchanges coming to get into FX than there could be a new type of exchange coming to this world. And I would say there is.
So you think that the traditional exchanges have gone into this, the CBOE, the CME, Deutsche Börse, they are at risk themselves of being overtaken by crypto exchanges who have better technology, better methods.
I think what will happen is that traditional exchanges will get left with some of the traditional products and the more complex products. But with the rise of stable coins and the digitization of various fiat currencies, why should spot be 2 days or 4 days over a weekend? Why should some of these other currencies and other products trade in the same way, be priced in the same way, and be settled or cleared in the same way? I think what will happen is pockets of business, like valuable business, will be lost to these exchanges and the traditional providers. And the same way that spot market making has to the likes of XTX, Jump and Citadel. I think there'll be pockets, and you'll have LCH left with what they do and a few others with what they do, but their other swathes of their business will disappear to new entrants.
Sorry, come in.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, first of all, that's happening today, right? I mean, we're doing real-time clearing and settlement. The trade is is essentially cleared and settled and executed on a blockchain ledger, and the ownership changes literally in milliseconds, right? So it's not only not hard to imagine, it's actually happening. I think the old world exchanges and clearinghouses, I think the problem they have is, and we've talked to some of them about what we're doing, and it feels like they're just trying to, they have a hammer and they're just looking for a different color nail when they really need to somehow differentiate. I mean, why would you go, what's the real reason, what's the motivation, to go and trade that way versus the way you currently trade, on the interbank market? I mean, the only thing that maybe makes more sense is really, and I think this is an underlying current or theme throughout all of this, is really around access and collateral management, and so those sort of things really have a big part in all of this in terms of the decision-making process. But the other thing I would say about the crypto exchanges is I think they also, having started from a blank slate with no regulatory overhead and in the beginning, I think they're also going about it the wrong way, right? Because if you look at the problems that you have today in the digital asset space around those exchanges custodying client assets. And so what I really think the way this is going to play out is you're going to have greater importance around custody of collateral. Collateral is not going to move around. It's going to stay where it's at. It's going to be tokenized. It's going to be freely tradable across any of these exchanges. And that's that's kind of the future that I see based on the progress or lack of progress that's coming from the two different camps.
Sorry, just a simple question for you. Do you see exchanges which own a clearinghouse, which gives the customers the incentive of collateral and capital savings, is that an illusory advantage to them, the way the market is developing? Is clearing no longer relevant in the world you're describing?
We just took a totally different approach, right? So a hybrid approach where you have collateral that's provably backing transactions that stays put in people's own accounts at their own custodians, where those trades can essentially self-clear and settle, thinking about it from a fully collateralized point of view. Where's the counterparty and settlement risk in that, if it's implemented correctly? And so if you think about, the closest analog would be something like CLS Bank. I mean, what's the point of CLS Bank? It's so they can essentially make these payment versus payment transactions on behalf of the parties. There are new ways of doing that through the tokenization of the value and the ability to do atomic transactions or atomic exchanges of assets on custodial blockchain ledgers. You can essentially just re-engineer the entire process in a way that I think ultimately is better for everybody.
I'm not sure the advantage of CLS Bank is counterparty risk payment versus I think it's about the netting, is it not?
Well, sure. Yeah. Ultimately, it's netting, but at the end of the day, what's the main thing they're doing? They're holding everybody's balances and they're swapping the balances out, concurrently, so that nobody has any hairstyle risk, right? So that's the netting is a really important part of it, and that obviously plays into efficient use of collateral and so on.
Andy, is that grunt to indicate you wanted to say something?
I just don't think this is, the client end of the market just doesn't work this way. I think it's, you're a long way from convincing a local government pension scheme to, be using atomic swaps to do their FX. And I think there is relevance in what you're saying to, that the sort of very professional end of the market. But I think that the issue is, adoption is going to be a lot slower from the customer end. I think that the asset manager, particularly the long-only asset management community, is a long way from this, and there's the way that collateral applies is very different for them.
Okay, well let's talk about that, Andy. Since you've raised the subject, how well do buy sides and corporates understand that they're paying too much for FX? Should they not be more active, as you said at the outset, in actually driving change in this marketplace? Why aren't they trading directly with each other more often? There are vendors out there who would help them do that.
Yeah, I think this is a path. I mean, to get to, what Rosario is talking about is something that requires an understanding that change is, a component of that. And, at the moment we see very few people asking the right questions. I don't think the asset owner layer is particularly aware that foreign exchange costs money full stop. We've come across a client this week who was absolutely horrified to discover that his FX costs were 10 times what his equity and bond brokerage costs were, because he thought it was a free service. I mean, this seems to be stuff that you imagine goes back, 20 years. That there are people out there who are that confused by foreign exchange that they're in that boat. So, I'm not saying it's not the way it's going to go. What I'm saying is that there's an awful lot of people who are a long way behind the curve you're indicating.
We've had our first question in, but before I read it out, Adrian, I'd just like a comment from you really on why aren't buy sides and corporates more enthusiastic about trading directly with each other? I can see that they actually need the money, they want to pay for something, or they want to make an investment, but at the same time, as Andy has just pointed out, the costs they're incurring are much larger than they think they are. Is it banks, preventing them trading directly with each other, or what? Why don't they just net their trades before going to market, for example?
They're actually locked into, not intentionally by the banks, I don't think, but actually it's not even the banks. There's 3 or 4 systems that they're actually locked in, or they use to allocate and execute the trades. That it's really hard for them and the people who make the prices into them to get away from. And then it just comes down to inertia, that they go, oh, do you know what? I'm just used to putting my trades in that way, and it works, and I'm used to it. And to be honest, they're lazy, or they just don't want to change it. And there's the State Street owned one, the via FX Connect, and there's Refinitive's FX All Settlement Center, and these people are just stuck in it, and it's hard to get them out of it.
Okay, yeah, but I think people are definitely trying to tackle this, right? I mean, there was recent announcements by Vanguard putting together a peer-to-peer trading solution based on blockchain for real money firms to trade with each other. It's not that people aren't thinking about it, and I think Adrian's right. I think there is a certain amount of lock-in and just gravitational pull to sort of the way that people do things, but that's changing, and I think Andy's right. I mean, they'll be the last, the buy side. Some of the buy side will be the last to kind of jump on this bandwagon. But certainly, if you talk to the non-bank market makers, for example, in the FX space, they are dying for alternatives to get around using prime brokerage in the traditional sense. and doing that, being able to market make to counterparties without having to actually take on the credit risk directly themselves. And so I think that's probably where it will start, and it'll fan out from there. And I think it's the job of the industry that's trying to drive the innovation to actually make sure that not forcing a change in workflow, right? I mean, you can't reinvent that wheel entirely. You really have to do this sort of in a more delicate way, I think.
Okay, I'd like to bring in some of the questions and comments we're getting now. And Andy, I'd like you to think about this one, but not answer it immediately. Yep. It's from Paul Miz. Buy-side to buy-side trading is a coincidence of wants market. The sell side offers prices on demand. I'm sure you'll have a view on that. But let's think about that. I'll come back to you in a minute. Anastasia Kinsky has asked, made the following observation. Next week, industry and regulators are meeting for the V20 summit, part of G20 week. Virtual asset service providers are meeting over 3 days to talk about the regulation needed to help the sector thrive. Do the panelists feel that the travel rule, and indeed the approach of global regulators, has been beneficial to enabling the industry to digitalize? She says regulators are also taking part, the FATF, MAS, FinCEN, JFSA, and Bermuda Monetary Authority also speaking. So the question is really, do we think regulators can help this industry to digitalize more rapidly?
Well, things don't really happen very quickly when regulators get involved, do they? I mean, it'd be nice to see them do something, but they rarely do. I mean, they don't really seem to enforce their own rules, let alone change them.
But there's a problem here, isn't there, Andy, which is that it's a global industry. While the participants get regulated at the national level, you can't regulate this industry at a global level. In some ways, it remains an unregulated industry. That's why they came up a couple of years ago with this global FX code, which is a kind of list of ways of doing business which are ethical, following a whole series of scandals in the industry. And going back to the buy side, I noticed that very few buy side firms have signed up to that code. All the sell side have. And the funny thing about the code is that long annex in the back, which lists all the things you shouldn't do in the FX market. There were like 59 different examples of ways in which buy-side corporate clients get effectively ripped off by their FX providers. Yet they're not even signing up to this code, despite the evidence staring them in the face from an official publication.
Yes, I think I've spoken about that already. I mean, the fact that I would say ignore the buy and the sell side. The problem is with the asset owner. It's just very, very fundamental. They're not driving standards and change through the industry because they're unaware of the problems that they're facing. And, it's not really the asset manager who wants to be sitting there saying, look, hey, this could all be done better. Because as Adrian points out, they're wedded to systems and they're wedded to a lot of other problems. So they don't want to be changing things. It's going back to the global code issue. You're absolutely right. But, it astonishes me that there isn't sort of a provision in there for asset owners. And, the moment at which the global code dropped the insistence on the right timestamps, the whole thing's kind of irrelevant. And I would say that the fate of Mark Johnson in the States is very problematic for the global code. After all, everything he did, as Colin Lambert has regularly pointed out, everything that Mark did complies with the global code. So if you can end up in federal prison for complying with the global code, then I think it's got some very, very fundamental flaws in it. And it doesn't seem to me that it protects anybody. It certainly doesn't protect the asset owner, and it doesn't protect the person on the desk executing the transaction for the bank either, fairly obviously.
Just remind us, Mark Johnson was the guy who ran FX at HSBC, is that right?
Yeah, he was global head of trading at HSBC. He executed a transaction for Capital Ken, the energy company at least anyway, and at a fix. So theoretically at a benchmark rate, a market counterpart, customer relationship, and he's ended up in prison for it. So, it's a very big problem.
Okay. Now, don't forget my Paul Miss comment too. He's added to it now. He said,
"Oh God, yeah."
Talk about the buy side coincidence of wants. Like he's added, it could work well for trades done at the fix. 4 o'clock.
Well, I think the point is the point with these the Vanguard system you're talking about, Rosario, is hedge pool.
which is not blockchain in any way. There's another one called SiegeFX that we supply rates to. I think I don't know Jay Moore well, so I'm not going to comment on hedge pool. I'm sure it's a very well done business. But talking about the Siege business, the concept there is that not trading at all. It's about netting flows before they go to market. And what we see from this is that there are lots and lots of foreign exchange risks that are generated significantly before they are executed. Leaving those risks in a netting pool where they can be netted down before they are executed, before they do go to market, enables you to reduce the amount that you have to take to market and thereby reduce your market footprint, reduce your, you have no market impact cost if you net your transaction because you're just randomly netting with somebody else who's coincidentally there at the same time. So it shouldn't be confused with trading, I think is the main thing. It's also not regulated the same way as trading. It falls outside the MiFID rules. So, it's netting. It's very specifically a different thing to trading.
Okay, well, Paul Miss, I think, agrees with you. He said it could work well for trades done at the fix and rolling passive hedges. If I want liquidity now for broken dates, I have to call a few asset managers to see if they're interested. That's not really efficient.
No, I don't think that's the aim of the. I don't think the idea is to do that. I don't think that that's the plan at all. I think the concept is Siege is focused on spot in any case. So the point about broken dates isn't relevant here, but that's relevant to hedge pool, I would say. But it's about having risk that you're generating through underlying activity in other asset classes and being able to net that off with people on the same side of the fence as you before you take whatever remaining risk you have to market.
Oh, Adrian, you put your head in your hands at the mention of the fix. I don't know whether that was a comment on the 4 o'clock fix or whether you wanted to add something on this. But
yeah, well, listen, that's another mess, isn't it? Most of the banks don't even like it.
No, that's
and you're having to trade at a mid rate for the buy side. Like it's just nuts. But it's, do you know what? It's like regulators, to be honest, they're not going to do a lot. But on these matters, I don't think. But what I think is going to happen, and we're starting to see it, is that some banks are changing how they do things, and they are coming into crypto and digital. And that between some of the larger market participants, the odd bank, non-banks, and new entrants and buy side, I think that new processes are being designed not just around execution, but also around, like as Rosario correctly mentioned, it's like management of collateral. That's happening now, and that's going to keep happening. And where it's going to start is in this trading market, which is less about delivery and more about taking risk or offsetting risk. And with the non-bank market makers, and there's going to be a lot that happens there over the next year to 18 months. And that's going to change, I think, how a big part of the market works. And some early banks will be in that and some are not even seeing it yet. But I think that's where the change will happen. And I think those participants will create best or new best industry practices that incorporate on-chain PVP settlement within settlement windows, but enabling that to happen with fiat currencies and the tokenization of fiat currencies. And that's going to happen 100%. It's being worked on now, and there's a number of projects, and that will be where the innovation, I think, in this trading market really heats up.
Okay, just before we leave the subject of you've given us a great segue there, Adrian, into what I really want to talk about next, which is this whole crypto tokenization technology, how this can change things, starting, as you say, on the trading side. But just a last comment: is the FX Global Code a dead letter? And I ask that because implicit in that code is that from the regulators is if you don't clean up your act, we are going to regulate you directly. It's not clear how they do that, but that is the clear, explicit threat. So my question is the FX Global Code dead now? Because if it is, we can look forward to direct regulation. Or the FX industry can look forward to direct regulation, I think.
Well, it's there's huge parts of it that people aren't complying with. Just take code 41 about the managing of risk and credit for your clients properly. That's not done. Other than our clients, they are fully compliant. Fortunately, I just thought I'd get that little one in.
Yeah, it's all right to make one sale.
Sorry to push my book. but no, it's how long will it take regulations to come in, even if they decide they want to?
Okay, Anastasia Kinsky has said, thanks for a great answer. We have been thinking about the role of the FX code and what standards best industry practices could deliver to the community a lot, as we've been developing a similar structure for digital assets, the GDF code of conduct, brackets gdf.io. She's got a plug in there as well. We'd love to discuss further and talk about the regulation. So Anastasia, we need to engage you in our work. We've done a lot of thinking ourselves and had a couple of events now on how tokenization is working in the securities markets. But that's a topic for another day. And we've got a couple of events coming up on that in the new year. So look out for those. Rosario, this is the heart of the matter. What can technology do for the FX markets? And in particular, how will the technology, you've touched on this a bit already, how will the technology being used in the cryptocurrency industry, how can it be applied to the FX markets? Where do the big opportunities lie? Is it in trade or post-trade? And is this a blockchain play, or is it some other kind of technology which we're talking about here? I'm asking you a lot in the space of this. So what can we do? How can you break the dependence of the market on bank intermediation and bank credit? And what have you learned from the cryptocurrency markets that is going to be useful in the FX markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer that, we look at sort of where, I look at where sort of we started 5 years ago in the digital asset space when I left the FX space temporarily. There is no analog for prime brokerage in the digital asset space. So the fundamental thing that we have tried to solve with technology, pure technology, without being a counterparty to the trades, without relying on our own balance sheet, is how do you make it possible for anybody to face any other counterparty without that trading counterparty and settlement risk? And we've figured out a way to do that. That's now in full swing. I mean, I think we're about 7 weeks into our production launch. We're closing in on about $1 billion cleared and settled over this platform. So it's no longer a theory. It's in practice, and it really comes down to people having the way you're managing people's collateral and the way that is integrated into the trading life cycle. And so the thing I think that people get confused about around, there's a lot of noise, unfortunately, in the digital asset space, and there's a lot of confusion around asset tokenization. There's definitely asset tokenization where you're talking about the primary issuance of a natively digital asset on a public blockchain ledger like Ethereum, where it's heavily focused around all of the compliance and all of the other rules around making sure those assets, are when they trade, they're compliant with the various regulations and all of the complexity that goes with that. What a lot of people don't understand is that you can take any asset that's not natively digital, and you can actually tokenize that asset in a way where the custodian is responsible for holding it on behalf of the parties. It now lives on an enterprise blockchain layer where it's then freely tradable with anybody else, where you can do an atomic exchange of that asset for any other value that's within that ecosystem. And that is something that's very enterprise, private permission, suitable for banks and institutions, not involving putting assets out onto a public ledger system. And so I think what we've tried to do is actually solve the problem of delivering an equivalent of prime brokerage for the digital asset space. Now the question comes, what if you're not doing fully funded transacting? What do you do when people want to trade on credit, or when you need to have prime services and leverage and and all the rest, that whole spectrum of things that people need. And I think where the tokenized collateral on those blockchain ledgers comes in is it makes it, especially in the context of doing that where it sits at a custodian, really opens up the possibilities for truly frictionless aggregation of third-party balance sheet. And there's kind of really interesting thought experiments. I mean, if you look at the DeFi space, there's $12 billion of assets locked up in that space now where people are chasing yield and lending assets. That's third-party balance sheet that's being made available for lend for a yield, right? So when I look at how to map that onto the FX space, I think immediately about things like, how do I let a non-bank market maker face a retail broker where they can stay prime broked if they want, but they don't need a tier 2 credit intermediary between them and the retail broker, right? I think about, how does a bank take a system like this and that offers prime brokerage, or that wants to get into prime brokerage? How do they do that without relying exclusively on their own credit allocation and taking all of that risk on their own balance sheet? And it really comes down to, again, this real-time collateral management possibility where people can control their own assets, have them at custodians, and essentially make those assets available for lend in these different contexts, right? And so that's kind of my view of how it all fits together and how you map what we've tried to solve for in digital asset space, where there is no prime brokerage, onto benefits, in a prime broked market like the FX market.
So if I was to summarize what you're saying, instead of relying on a prime broker to intermediate you as a credit, what we learned from the DeFi token market, for example, is that bilateral or preferably trilateral, i.e. it's a custodian bank, collateralization can replace bank credit intermediation. Right.
Yeah.
Unless I'm wrong. Tell me.
No, that's basically right. I mean, if you think about, there's lots of people that know how to price the risk of the intraday risk of a retail broker's client base as they are punting FX around, right? There's hedge funds, there's all sorts of folks that know how to price that risk, and not just the current prime of primes, right? So, if I'm a prime broker, like, I've had this discussion with a couple of the big tier 1 banks, right? They're looking at solutions like this. What if I didn't have to give my client 30-to-1 leverage? What if I just onboard them and they use my rails and they use access to the other asset classes, which is, by the way, half of why I give them FX prime brokerage anyway, is because I want them to trade these other assets. What if I can let them source all the leverage they need from a third party and do that in a frictionless way where I still own the client relationship? Those are the kinds of conversations that we're having.
Okay, I think we're agreeing that the innovations here, I think all three of you have said this in different ways, are going to come from the trading side. Now we've had a question here from Henry Vaughan, which I think is relevant to this discussion. He takes us back to what you were talking about, Andy, with Siege. He says, regarding FX netting service providers such as Siege FX and Hedgepool, their value is clear, but surely their value is only created if a large quantum of market participants are using the service. If there's slow adoption, will customers, how many people are actually using these netting systems, and are clients lacking the ability to match trades due to a lack of participants? This is back to the double coincidence of wants. Will this deter people from using these systems and continue to use traditional execution methods? I suppose, in other words, if we're asking ourselves, where is change in this marketplace going to come from? Is it post-trade? Adrian's talked about the $1 billion costs of running the back office basically in the FX market. So it's not immaterial, but we are talking mainly about trading as being the area of change. And I know, Andy, you've said that this netting isn't really about trading, but you could say it's front office, isn't it? It's where the trades are struck, where they're executed, and before you go to market. So it's kind of pre-trade and trade is the area which the netting engines work in, right?
The answer to that point is, why wouldn't you take the free option of seeing if you can net? I think that would be insane, just saying, I didn't net yesterday, so I'm not going to try to net today. That's ridiculous. The uptake, I think, on those is good. There's an awful lot of very large buy sides involved in those projects, and
But how do you build a market? How do you build liquidity into a netting engine of that type? Because you yourself have said, the buy side and the corporate's a bit slow on the uptake with this stuff. How do we, having a brilliant idea is great, but how do you get people to use your?
Well, I mean, the thing to realize if you're on the buy side is that you own the liquidity. I mean, it is you're the thing that provides the liquidity to the market. You asking for a price is what stimulates the whole of the rest of the chain that results in these transactions happening and this volume going through. I mean, obviously, we'll exclude what's speculative in that, but that's how it works. So if you own liquidity, then you've got the power to do what you want with that liquidity. And I think that that's the piece that isn't understood, is that there's value in that, and other people are extracting that value at the moment, maybe the banks, but that can change.
Okay, what about, and the risk of bowling you an underarm ball here, is data the answer to this question? Is the fact that the corporates and the buy side don't really know what's going on at this point, because the market, however you describe it, is pretty opaque. So how would they know what's a good rate? How would they know how well their agents are performing in the FX market on their behalf? They don't really know that, do they? Because the data is not available.
No, they get told whether the things are good or bad. And obviously, if you're a broker, you're always going to say that things are okay. You're never going to turn up with terrible TCA. I think that the customers who are allowing their banks and brokers to mark their own homework will be woken up at some stage, and they'll move along. But there's plenty of people who understand that it's absolutely crucial to measure a bank's market impact with an independent rate. You can't measure a bank's market impact off the bank's rate. It's impossible. I mean, quite aside from the regulator, I made a slightly snide comment earlier about the regulator enforcing its own rules. I mean, it's absolutely clear in MiFID that you are not allowed to use a rate from a single bank, or indeed from an FX platform, to do TCA. It's absolutely crystal clear. Point 17, page 60 of the regulatory technical standards. I'll get it tattooed on my arm. But it, that's just completely unenforced. And I think where I don't really want to dwell on transaction cost analysis because it's not interesting particularly, but where it is, where TCA is being supplied by the institution on non-independent data, where it's breaching that rule, then there's a problem. And eventually somebody has to come and look at those things and say, but, it goes back still to the asset owner who still is not insisting that things are done right.
Isn't this an area, Adrian, where the regulator could intervene constructively by insisting that the data is made available in sufficient quality and sufficient quantity for the usual artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms to get to work on it, so that actually everybody has a much clearer insight, much greater transparency into what is going on in the marketplace in real time?
I'm not sure. I don't understand half of this, to be honest, because what I don't get is that I can get a spot rate from a retail broker, 1 pip euro dollar. I can aggregate the top 10 bank feeds and I can get euro dollar to 0.2 of a pip most of the day. Actually, I'll probably have 1,000 areas worth of backwardation on that. And I get that we talk about the trading part, but what's happened, what I think happens is sort of, as I said before, people are used to using the same thing, but also the huge cost is, it's not the execution, it's all the stuff that's bundled with it. And all of that cost, it's like bundling. In most markets, it's illegal. It's like you get done for being a monopoly, for bundling your data and with your TV and stuff and trying to do that. Right. The regulators should insist on the unbundling. And so if execution's being done and there's the spot price, and then if you're using the allocations tool, like say that it's being charged at $10 a million or something, which is far more than you pay for execution at EBS. I did my head with, I used to have an ECN called Mako FX, and I would have to soft some of my customers $1 a message or $1 a million just to send tickets to their back office, because that's what they were getting charged. Like, the cost is with all of the bundling and all of these services, in my opinion, after the actual execution. And the poor old spot guys making the prices into this mess, like, they're not making much money because there's not much there. It's all the stuff that comes after.
So
I think the point is,
Adrian is really saying that the problem is a vertically integrated monopoly, which bundles up all the services and overcharges at the back end. It's not the price transparency. Is he right?
It's not just the banks.
no, it's not.
It's on the banks. It's the service providers that are within that as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we've just done some research with Lumens, and we surveyed 2,000 funds, tried to identify the between the master and the sub-fund share classes. And the average cost of foreign exchange was 37 basis points a year. It works out on the volume data that we had from the AUM. It works out at about $270 a million for trading swaps. I mean, can you imagine? It's astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing in this day and age that is what people are paying, and they seem to think that this is just normal. And it goes back to why is it not taking off? Well, people just aren't looking at it, and they're worrying about what they're doing with their allocation overall, and should you be in Germany or should you be in America or what have you. But well, what about the FX? You do it every single day. It's just rolling your hedges is 12 times your AUM already in terms of volume, and you're paying $270 a million to do it when the rest of the market's paying 2, 3, 4. It's madness.
Rosario, I imagine this is music to your ears. You're hearing about a value chain which is very extended, with lots of people taking a bite out of these transactions, which are adding up to very significant transaction costs, which the end customer is not actually measuring very well or understanding very well. Am I right to think that you need to incorporate this in your sales pitch?
I think, well, what I was actually thinking when I heard the $270 a million number was that I don't know, I'm gonna have to tell
move into that business
asset space about that, because they're already complaining about costs, and it's like inning one. So I'm not thinking about the world that deeply from the execution cost point of view. I'm much more focused on how do I make it possible for anybody to face anybody to trade whatever they want and do that in a risk-free way. And so I'm sure I'll get there, but not a lot to add to the conversation around best execution at the moment.
So what is the solution? Adrian, I know you've invested a lot of time and effort in trying to manage downwards that bundling in the back end. You've spent a lot of time talking to banks who are racking up those costs. In the end, what is the obstacle to them radically transforming the cost of what they're doing after the poor old spot trader has made his measly millionth of a basis point on the trades, and they're adding all this cost back to the customer? How do you change that conversation?
Cool, dear. If I knew that, I'd tell you what. If you could tell me how, I'd make a fortune.
But tell us about the conversations you've had. Then, what are the reasons banks don't change?
Yeah, listen. We have bank and non-bank clients, and even exchanges as clients. But it's and with the best banks, it's a really easy discussion. I have to give a shout out to Standard Chartered. They got what we were trying to do. They signed a contract, and within 6 months, they're fully live across prime brokerage and the whole franchise wholesale part of their bank. Amazing. And it can be done because it's just connecting APIs. That's all it is. We just need a connection to the bank's risk management system, and we get on with it. It's purely API driven. I think that once the rest of the industry sees some banks, not just Standard Chartered, but others out there innovating and changing how they do things, that the rest will need to, or some will react. And but I think we have to, as a company and other people in fintech, be clearer and in the benefits. But listen,
to be clear, have Standard Chartered had to radically reconfigure their internal systems in order to accommodate change?
No, it's we take their versions of trade from the risk management system. We take the execution copies from the venues that we're already connected to. We create a single version, and then pump out the net cash flows to their back office system. So no, like they have to do work, but it was all done in well less than a year. So
what have they saved?
Oh, listen, I'm not allowed to say, but they seem quite happy. I think I'll get a nice Christmas card, but no, it's not just about cost; it's also risk, and that's a big problem with the current market. And I've got this document that I worked on recently to explain the traditional workflow of a trade and all the bits it goes through and all the risks involved, and the one bank that has 600 staff globally trying to manually sort out the reconciliation process of trade breaks just for FX. That's one bank, 600 people for manual processes of trade breaks, etc. Listen, there'll be banks that are seen to innovate and do things, and others will follow and others won't, and others will use other people to innovate other than COBOL. It's not just about COBOL. People use
private theory that 80% of people in financial services are working in reconciliation. So you can see why there's resistance. But look, we only have less than 5 minutes to go. So I just thought we might like to end by trying to work out how we can accelerate progress in this area. Now the UMR has been postponed, I think, to, am I right about this, Andy, to next year? September 21, whatever it is. Is the uncleared margin rule going to accelerate things? Has it accelerated things, or is it continually being postponed, mean it hasn't had as much impact as we'd like?
I just don't, I'm not quite sure, what impact it is going to have. It might be better, it might be good for the exchanges as people start to have to post margin for transactions, but, I think as things stand, it's the status quo, isn't it?
Pretty good for you, Rosario? Your collateralization-driven model, collateralized trades, capital relief.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does come down to just a big real-time collateral management exercise where there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of opportunity to maybe do it better than people are currently contemplating it.
What about standards in this field? Adrian, I'm sure you have thoughts on this. You're trying to hook up all these different systems in the back end of banks. Would that job be easier if there was an agreed, even mandatory set of data exchange standards, communication standards in the area?
Listen, undoubtedly, it would make a huge difference, both for the data, mandatory use of LEIs in systems. There'll be huge pushback on that because it would involve legacy technology service providers into these companies having to re-platform that they don't want to do. Standardization of nomenclature for pairs, tenors, rates, even standardized amount of decimal places. Standards for connectivity. That'd be great. You look at, again, what's happening in crypto, where so much of it uses the ERC20 protocol on Ethereum for managing tokens. It's just the widespread adoption of it and how they all interact. But I should stress, though, that the crypto area also has a lot to learn from how things happen in foreign exchange, because there's certain processes and ways of doing things that are done for a reason. Like, not everything is bad in FX. The processes some of those processes need to change, but the role of CLS and what they do is important. It doesn't mean it can't change or be done differently, but I do think the digital world has a lot to learn from how financial markets do things, because there's some things they don't do very well.
Rosario, you're not tempted to come back on that?
No. I agree wholeheartedly, and I think a good example of that is things like let's all just trade on credit and have legal agreements where we promise to pay each other and do bilateral settlement however and whenever. And that obviously needs to get regulated away. And we're starting to see, if you read between the lines, I saw a letter that the SEC put out, some clarifications to some broker dealers recently, and they're starting to talk more specifically about models. So I think Adrian's right. There's good reason to have certain structures and processes in place. I think there's better ways to do it than the traditional world. I don't think you get a lot of joy out of just trying to do a copy paste from traditional world to the digital world in terms of things like prime brokerage, where you're just relying on balance sheet and things like that. I think there's better ways to do it, but some of the processes are there for a reason and need to come into digital as well.
Mm-hmm. Now our time is up, but I'd like to wrap this discussion up by asking each of you a question, which is, Adrian has explained that standards would help a great deal to accelerate progress in the digitization of the FX industry. The question is, who should set those standards? Is a private sector initiative possible to agree standards, or does it require a public regulatory intervention? Andy, what do you think it will take to impose standards? Can it be done by agreement between all the participants, or do we need a regulator or group of regulators or international regulators step in and say, do this?
I think I'll go back to the phrase customer is king. If the customer informs him or herself about the way that the market works, that the costs that they're incurring through the processes that are not very good, and starts to demand improvements across the board, that will drive the change, that will set the standards.
So we don't need an intervention at all. Normal market forces will do the job. Adrian, are you content to rely on normal market forces? Do you think we need regulatory intervention or private sector collaboration of some kind?
I'd be very happy if a market authority or someone did something that brought it along and made sense. But I'll be honest, we're talking with a number of firms about where we're integrating and doing things, and having really good conversations where we're agreeing with other firms that we interact with about how we make our systems work much better with each other. But I think in many ways, blockchain is a standard. And I think that I'm skeptic about blockchain for a while, but the digitization and tokenization of something and the ability to pass it between other tokens and other members on a network, that's a standard. That's sort of like the internet. But to be honest, that could probably benefit from some sort of standardization or some authority to guide how it's done. Whether it's going to come from the regulators, I would doubt.
Sorry, last word from you then. You've heard Andy say the customer is one set of market forces which could have an impact on accelerating digitization. Adrian's explained that he thinks technology, particularly in the shape of blockchain, could similarly drive digitization. So the pair of them in different ways are reliant on, or happy to rely to a large extent on market forces doing the job rather than regulators or industry stitch-ups.
Yeah, I mean,
your perception of where the change will come from.
Yeah, I mean, the future is definitely digital, and blockchain, both private, enterprise and public, has a major role to play in all of this. But I think we need all of it. I think we need regulators to give clarity and to not avoid giving regulatory clarity in the digital asset space. I think, but I really agree with Andy too. I mean, the customers on all fronts, in the FX space, in the digital asset space, especially the people that have the most at stake. I look at the digital asset space. If you're a fiduciary, you need to be pushing for things to be done the right way. I mean, this, even though it was born out of sort of Wild West, I mean, I think the customers do have to stand up and say, hey, if you want to transact with me or you want my business, we need to have some standards here. And so I think it's really all of the above.
Last word from Anastasia. We should all join the V20 next week, where we talk about InterVAS messaging standard developed for R16 and solutions being built. So work is clearly clearly going on. But sadly, our time is up, our hour is gone. It remains for me only to thank our three excellent panelists, Rosario Ingardiola of Bosonic, Adrian Patton of Cobalt, and Andy Woolmer of New Change FX. And thank you to our audience too for your interest, and especially your questions and comments. Here at Future of Finance, our next webinar is a week today, 19th of November, same time, same place, if you're staying at home to watch. As I am to moderate it. It's on the fascinating topic of quantum computing in financial services, and we hope as many of you as possible will join us then. But for now, it's goodbye from the four of us. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Andy. Andy, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to our panel. If you would like to see the summary of this discussion, please visit our website on www.futureoffinance.biz. And indeed, if you would like to see the video again, that is also on our website. Many thanks.